Welcome to Echoing Faith Today, a podcast conversation on catechetical themes of impact and relevance in the new Directory for Catechesis from the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of the New Evangelization. I'm Dr. Jem Sullivan, host and faculty in the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America. On this podcast, we'll hear from scholars, experts, and those in pastoral ministry as they share insights into major themes in the new Directory for Catechesis. So welcome back and thank you for taking your place at this table of conversation. In Chapter 1 of the Directory for Catechesis, titled Revelation and its Transmission, the text focuses on the evangelization of cultures and the enculturation of faith. It affirms that the relationship between the gospel and culture poses both challenges and opportunities for the Church. Joining us to discuss these questions is Dr. Hosffman Ospino, Associate Professor of Hispanic Ministry and Religious Education in the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. Dr. Ospino's research concentrates on the dialogue between theology and culture and the intersection between theological education, catechesis, and ministry. Dr. Ospino, thank you for joining me today. I've been looking forward to our conversation and I'm very grateful for your time. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jem. It's a true pleasure to be part of the conversation and better even to engage in dialogue with you.
Yes, thank you again. This new Directory for Catechesis has been long awaited. Now that it's here, your thoughts on its significance for catechesis in the United States in general and for Hispanic ministry in particular.
Definitely. This is a document that the catechetical community was waiting for decades, not because the previous one had major flaws or anything. It's simply that the church, is constantly reflecting about this important ministry. And something that we have come to realize, particularly in the last century and a half, is that life moves fast. Things are changing really fast. Sometimes when I read the Second Vatican Council, I look at some of the issues that they raised, and then I realize, my goodness, they are not even naming half of the realities that are affecting our lives these days. So the directories, in many ways, help us to somehow catch up a little bit with life as people are, experience it, in their communities, in the different parts of the world. But at the same time, it allows us to raise new questions, about what it means to evangelize, to pass on the faith from one generation to the next, And also it's an invitation, I would say, for us in the United States of America, but also for Catholics everywhere else in the world, to look at catechesis with fresher eyes. What does it mean to pass on the faith here and now? Now, for Latino Catholics in the United States of America, I think that this new directory, comes at a very specific moment of our history. And the last time we had a directory was 1997. Back in 1997, Latinos in the United States of America were barely 25% of the entire Catholic population. And more than half of, as a matter of fact, more than half of Hispanics were immigrants, That was 1997. So the questions that religious educators working with the Latino community were asking were slightly different, compared to the questions that they're asking or we are asking today at a time in history when Latinos are about 43 to 45% of the entire Catholic population in the US, and 2/3 of Hispanics, as a matter of fact, are born in the United States. So different settings, different questions, and an opportunity to update what we are teaching, how we are teaching it in light of the circumstances that are shaping our lives.
So speaking of those new circumstances, new situations, and new questions, chapter 10 begins by noting that catechesis has an intrinsic cultural and social dimension, in that it is situated within a church that is incorporated into the human community. How might this directory then serve to guide a catechist who is seeking to respond to cultural diversity in parish life and in ministry?
Well, this is a beautiful question, and I mean, definitely one question that I have engaged in my own research and in my own reflections with catechetical leaders, with the communities throughout the country. The first thing I want to say is that we should always remember that we share our faith, the beauty of the Christian faith, as women and men who are inserted, who live our lives in the context of specific cultures. So it's in specific social contexts, no? Even in the United States of America, for instance, when I share the faith in New England, there is a different set of understandings about what it means to be someone in Boston or Maine or Providence, no. And then when I travel to the South East, for instance, when you travel to Mississippi, or you travel to Georgia, when one travels to the south, is in Florida, then we find yourself in a different socio-economic, cultural context. Then you travel to California and maybe in New Mexico, and then perhaps southern Texas, and it's like traveling to a different country, to traveling to different spaces. All this to say that yes, catechesis has this intrinsic and cultural dimension insofar as it invites us to think about how people are shaped by countless forces and influences every day, in the everyday. So we announce the good news, in light of the specific cultural realities in which we are, I mean, there are, I'm thinking, for instance, of Venezuelans in South America. They are living in a major moment of political turmoil. Many millions of Venezuelans have had to leave their country, and they are now living in exile in the United States, in Central America, in South America, and so on. So when they think of catechesis, the whole concept of exile and social political turmoil actually shapes their understanding. The United States of America, as a first world nation, or as a nation that has more means in many ways, financial, in terms of the influence that we exercise intellectually, politically, militarily in the world, invites us to a different set of questions as we consider the faith. And that's what catechesis, catechesis invites us to pay attention about these questions. What does it mean, to speak about Jesus Christ? What does it mean to speak about the church? What does it mean to speak about the God of revelation who calls us into relationship with the poor, or in relationship with those who are marginalized, into relationship with one another? What kind of families are being formed and shaped in these particular contexts? Now, in the United States of America, let me getting back to our own particular experience, we share the faith in the midst of a highly diverse church, So, I mean, what could go to a nation where the majority of people are, speak the same language, pretty much look the same, have similar values, people, there may be some nuances here and there, but it's pretty, common, the characteristics that they share are pretty common. In the United States of America, Catholicism is a highly diverse experience. This is not the Catholicism of the 1940s and 50s, when, you know, the majority of Catholics were Euro-American, you know, the children and grandchildren of immigrants, primarily white, Caucasian, primarily English speaking, many of them transitioning into the middle, upper classes. So it was quite an exciting, you know, Catholic experience. In the 21st century, we enter into a much different church, more diverse. No, we are now, for instance, you know, about 45% Hispanic, as I said earlier. No, but about 5-6% of all Catholics in the United States of America self-identify as Asian. And, you know, these Catholics bring in the richness of the Asian traditions and languages and symbolisms, you know, and experiences. About 3.94% of all Catholics are, you know, African American and Black, you know, immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean. We got a growing actually number of Native Americans, and then we still have the, you know, white Euro-American population that remains a strong, you know, strong in many parts of the country. So now, in the midst of this diversity, we find ourselves sharing communities. We find ourselves trying to figure out what it means to be church. And in that process of figuring out, you know, yes, there are moments when we embrace one another, but there are moments when there are tensions. You know, there are moments when we don't know when we don't like one another. You know. And I mean, we have to acknowledge that in some circumstances there is racism and there is bias and there is you know, cultural, racial bias, ethnic bias, and so sometimes we just need to deal with these matters. And the new director, in many ways, you know, it sends us into this this process of paying attention, you know, reading the signs of the times of our current circumstances. And the last thing I want to say about this is, you know, in that chapter 8. You know, I like the title of that chapter 8, you know, and we can talk more about it later on. But the title of chapter 8 is Catechesis in the Lives of Persons. And I find this fascinating. I would imagine that, you know, perhaps some of the drafters of the catechism were, you know, did it in Spanish, because it sounds very much like a Spanish expression, you know, Catequesis en la vida de las personas, which rings a bell for me as a Spanish-speaking person. And it's just fascinating because in a sense, you know, here we're not talking about a catechesis that is isolated from the realities of people, but it is catechesis that takes the realities, social, cultural, political, into consideration, because how else can we relate, you know, with God and the message of salvation?
You know, to that exact point, Dr. Ospino, I want to just move to Article 43, where the directory notes that the evangelization of culture requires getting to the heart of culture itself, where new themes and new paradigms are generated, reaching the deepest core of individuals and of societies in order to illuminate them from within with the light of the gospel. So again, reading the signs of the times, but bringing the light of the gospel to bear on those signs of the times. And then it says it is imperative to evangelize cultures in order to inculturate the gospel. So how are we to understand this dialogue of catechesis and culture? I think you've spoken to it already, but just how particularly do we look at the dialogue between catechesis and culture?
Yes, yes, Jem, and I think this is a beautiful question, and thank you for citing this particular passage. You know, uh, we need to come to terms with the fact that there is no such a thing as a person who is cultureless or a community that is cultureless. You know, we all are immersed in a culture. In the fact that you and I are communicating in English, you know, that means that we shared a culture. You know, the fact that we can speak about common values of Catholicism in the United States points to the fact that we are sharing in this particular culture. Perhaps my conversation would be more difficult if I were to having this conversation with somebody who speaks only Vietnamese, which I do not speak, you know, or I do not fully understand, you know, much of the Asian context, you know, culture and reality. So we all are inserted in a particular, you know, social, cultural reality, and that shapes everything that we do. Language, symbols, rituals, no, how we understand God, even the language that we use to speak about God. Um, I always find fascinating, that a lot of the language that we use for religion in some languages is neutral, so we don't know if it is male, female, it's simply this religious language. But in Romance languages, for instance, much of the language that we use for to refer to the divine or to refer to religious traditions is either male or female. And when you pay attention to those nuances, then immediately, you realize, wow, this is how people understand, their relationship with God. This is how people understand how they form families and how they form communities, and this is how they understand sacramental life, and on and on and on. No, so evangelization, and this is the reminder of this directory. And actually, I'm grateful that the previous directories also invited us to look at this. And I want to bring the conversation even back to Catechesis Tradendae, when Pope John Paul II, as a matter of fact, and throughout his pontificate, he also did likewise. And I'm glad that Pope Francis is picking up on this in a very strong way, that we need to pay attention to the cultures that give life, that are matrices where people, shape their values and come to understand not only how God becomes present in revelation, but also how we understand what it means to be human, how we shape, our own understanding of reality and relationships, and how we interpret and how we interpret God. So by paying attention to culture, then we're able to see the instances in which culture is receptive to the message of the gospel and allows the gospel to flourish. On the other hand, by paying attention to culture, we are able to see what are the obstacles to the gospel. There is no such a thing as a perfect culture. So yes, there is sin, there is structural sin in many cultures. There are limitations in many cultures that do not allow the gospel to flourish. And I think that the more we pay attention to these dynamics, of grace and sin in the context of a culture, the better educators in the faith we can be. There may be moments in which we might be able to evangelize in a more effective way through song or through music, through poetry, through literature in a particular culture. In another culture, we might be able to perhaps to engage more in philosophical dialogue or philosophical conversations. And it's not that one is better than the other. It's simply that cultures create this grammar that allow us to interpret and read reality. And the last thing I would say is that in an intercultural context, or in a culturally diverse context like Catholicism in the United States, there is an added bonus. And the added bonus is that we are able, in this diverse context, to listen to an intercultural dialogue. When in this country we see Euro-American Catholics engaging in dialogue with Latinx Catholics and African American Catholics and Native American Catholics and Asian Catholics and Catholics who actually inhabit different cultural worlds. And then we all start sharing those ideas and see how the gospel at the end of the day permeates all of them. Parents, adults in the family are the first evangelizers. They are the first catechists. So the first space where catechesis needs to take place is in the context of the family. And I think that what I think this director is doing, in a sense, is inviting us to give due attention to this responsibility and right of the families to educate the younger ones in the faith, you know. So it's very important to keep this in mind. Sometimes, you know, when I look at, you know, the programs that we have in our, you know, Catholic parishes and sometimes Catholic schools and other in campus ministry and other instances, I think that, you know, with the best of intentions, we ended up co-opting the role of the family as catechists, no? We kind of, I mean, we see parents who, I mean, we use the expression, drop the kids off, literally, you know, they just leave them in the, you know, in the parish or the school, assuming parents, you know, and the adults in the family, assuming that someone else is going to introduce those little ones, those younger ones into the faith. And I think that the directory reminds us very strongly that catechesis happens first in the context of the family. And then it goes on to say with the family. So not despite the family. And I'm so glad that it says that. It's not despite the family, but with the family. It's a collaborative effort, you know? And I think that this is an invitation to what's being done in many parts of Latin America, Asia, you know, what is done in many of the lay ecclesial movements to actually do adult catechesis of parents and adults, so that once these people understand better the faith and the content of the faith and the beauty of it, then they can share it themselves with the younger ones in the context of the family. I think that that's a partnership that the schooling system in, you know, that we use in catechesis, that we inherited, you know, in the United States, definitely, you know, echoing much of what's done, you know, through the Sunday school movement in the Protestant world. We became co-opted by that model and lost sight of that potential partnership. This directory, once again, you know, is inviting us to reclaim, you know, the role of catechesis as a partnership, you know, of the faith communities, the leaders, the catechists, and all other instances, you know, with a family. And the last point or the third preposition that it uses is of the family. There is a major need for catechesis to literally educate people about what it means to be a family through the lens of our Christian Catholic tradition. It's important to understand what marriage is about, you know, what bringing life is about, what, you know, the relationships among, you know, siblings, the responsibility of the family in society. So we tend to take, you know, the family for granted in religious education in our catechesis. And again, and the directory is saying we need to actually bring, you know, the topic of the family right at the right at the forefront. Something that is interesting in this section of the family is that you know, the directory. And again, this has been a concern, for, you know, on the part of Pope Francis, you know, and Pope Benedict the 16th also mentioned this on a regular basis, is pay attention to the complex lives that families live these days, you know. I mean, of course, we love the idea of the traditional nuclear family, mom, dad, children, you know, but we cannot be oblivious to the reality that, yes, there is separation and there is divorce, that there's domestic violence, there is poverty, there is, you know, there is family abandonment. And there are so many issues, you know, that affect the lives of families. And we as religious educators and evangelizers need to pay attention to this, no? So I read in this directory a strong desire to return to a, you know, catechesis of the family, or a family catechesis. And I think that this is very good. And one way of doing that is taking advantage of the experience of Catholics who are coming from other parts of the world that actually come from more communal settings and actually do catechesis primarily through the family.
Yes. I want to just also point out in the same chapter 8, what appears to be kind of a new theme, if you will, in the section devoted to catechesis with migrants. So for instance, in Article 275, it notes that the church has a specific form of pastoral care for migrants, which takes into account their cultural and religious characteristics. And then the document says, moreover, Christian migrants living their faith become proclaimers of the gospel in the receiving countries, thus enriching the spiritual fabric of the local church and strengthening its mission with their own cultural and religious traditions. So what do you think the document means when it speaks of a specific form of pastoral care for migrants, and how does this shape Hispanic ministry today?
Well, there is no doubt that our world, as we become more and more globalized, more and more interdependent, and have more access to mass media, we have become more aware of the fact that there are millions of people who are crossing borders everywhere. I mean, it is estimated that at any given time, 200 million people in the world are moving, from one place to another, or have just moved, crossing borders from one nation to another. And even when there are moments, in our history that prevent that from happening, when nations, for political, for health reasons, for safety reasons, close borders, they do it temporarily because, again, in this interconnected world, it's almost impossible. No, Pope Francis reminded us not long ago that right now we are witnessing the largest movement of bodies, literally, through migration since World War II. From one nation to another, and this is worldwide. So we cannot be blind or deaf to the reality of migration. We're talking about millions. In the United States of America, well, this is a nation of immigrants. For us, it's not news that immigrants constantly renew and bring, and that evangelization and catechesis should constantly be at the service or paying attention to the realities of immigrants. Let me just narrow down on the Latino community. We know that in the United States of America, since the year 1960, 71% of the growth of Catholicism in this country is due to the Hispanic community, largely immigrants, immigrants. So yes, I mean, we don't have to imagine immigrants. We see them in our communities. We see them at the border. We see people, and refugees. And this is not only Latino immigrants, but we got a large number of Asian immigrants and immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean, and immigrants still from Europe, which is something that sometimes we think that was something of the 19th century and early 20th century. No, we still have a large number of immigrants from Europe, and immigrants from Canada as well. So the immigrant experience is vivid in the United States of America. It's important. So now the question is, what do we do with this? What do we do with, how does that immigrant experience compel us to respond? How do we actually, reflect, about the immigrant presence? And I want to say briefly a few points inspired in this chapter 8. One of them is that we should never forget the fact that immigrants are God's presence in a society, in any society. Every human being without exception is image, and likeness of God. And when the immigrant arrives, and the immigrant and the refugee comes to our borders, come to our doorsteps, we have as women and men of faith, we have an obligation to see the face of Christ here. And immediately, everything should follow from there, should flow from there, So how do we embrace the immigrant? How do we serve the immigrant? How do we listen to the immigrant? How do we support the immigrant? And I think that this section on immigrants has not only spiritual connotations, but profoundly ecclesiological dimensions. because when we pay attention to the immigrant, through our evangelizing and catechizing efforts, then we need to start asking ourselves questions such as, how do immigrants, shape my experience in the here and now of my community, And in the case of Catholicism in the United States of America, we have these millions of immigrants coming from Latin America, the Caribbean, from Asia, from Africa, who are not new to Catholicism. So these people actually grew in Catholicism, in the matrices of cultural Catholicism in their own worlds, and they thrived there. And then they come to the United States of America, bringing the richness of that Catholicism, again, through symbols, through language, to celebrations, to rituals. And what they are doing is enriching our communities and sometimes challenging our communities. We cannot forget, or we cannot ignore the fact that the more time we settle into the United States of America as a society, we become more, quote unquote, Americanized, and sometimes, it happened to me as an immigrant, when I first came to the United States of America and I saw certain expressions of Catholicism and certain articulations of Catholicism, I actually found them foreign, I just thought, wow, this is not how I experienced Catholicism in Latin America. But I thought I was the only one, and I have friends who come from Africa, who come from Asia, who come even from Europe, and they see Catholicism in the United States of America sometimes too Americanized. So, and it's fine, every culture, every nation, every community has, is invited to do that, to integrate the gospel in their own ways. But what immigrants do is they invite us to, to embrace those other ways of being Catholic. At the same time, I think that a catechesis that pays attention to immigrants is a catechesis that serves as an invitation to do an assessment of how we live Catholic life every day. We know that being an immigrant is not easy. We know that many immigrants struggle. We know that many immigrants are discriminated against. We know that many immigrants live in isolation. We know that many immigrants, as a matter of fact, are exploited and are overworked. And we got all sorts of difficulties associated with the immigrant experience, besides all the many good experiences that are also associated with being an immigrant. But I think that, when we raise awareness about the immigrant experience and its challenges, then it opens a major door for us to, one, reconnect with the teachings of the church on Catholic social teaching, the Catholic social teaching principles that we have, how do we engage in solidarity, how do we promote social justice, how do we support life, in the lives of these people. So it opens a whole new world, but at the same time, the immigrant presence is an invitation into humility, to realize that despite the fact that we call ourselves Catholic and we may have these beautiful communities and these beautiful schools and these beautiful structures, there is a lot to learn. And immigrants bring those gifts into our lives and to our communities.
I want to go back to the first part of the new directory, which is titled Catechesis and the Evangelizing Mission of the Church. And in chapters 3 and 4, the text discusses the identity and formation of catechists. I thought that I was very struck by that when I first looked at this document. Why is this priority given to the vocation and formation of catechists early on in the document?
Yes. When I first read this section of the Catechism, I actually went back and compared, to the previous two directories, the 1971 one and the 1997. And they both talk about the importance of forming catechetical leaders and forming the catechists. What I find interesting and novel in this one is a strong emphasis, a stronger emphasis, because it's also present in the previous one, on the question of vocation, vocation, missionary vocations. And again, this is an imprint of Pope Francis's pontificate, that invitation to see ourselves as missionary disciples, which is rooted in our baptism. So the vocation, the calling to be missionary disciples, I think it's an invitation, it's a renewed invitation to first have an experience of Christ, because I mean, we cannot train, I teach in a university, and we grant degrees a galore, like all universities do, and we get certificates. But let's be honest, a doctoral degree, a master's degree, a certificate, or a graduate certificate don't make you a disciple. What makes us disciples is the encounter with the Lord, And I think that's where it needs to begin. I think that the emphasis on vocation is an invitation to be true witnesses of the resurrection, true witnesses of the love of God as God becomes revealed in history. And then, everything else flows from that. Of course, we want catechists with master's degrees, and I love catechists, religious educators with doctoral degrees, and the more the merrier, But everything needs to hang precisely from that sense of vocation. And I think that the whole concept of missionary discipleship is in many ways an opportunity, an invitation to somehow push, as Pope Francis has indicated, to be a church en salida, a church that goes out. So we cannot imagine a catechesis that is just about waiting for people in a classroom, or waiting for people behind a screen these days, on Zoom, waiting for people to show up on a screen. But as a matter of fact, what we want is a catechesis that goes out, a catechesis that proclaims and then invites others to do this. And I just found fascinating that the previous directory has actually names or lists 6 tasks for catechesis. This one only names 5, But what it does is it takes the missionary dimension and interweaves it in the others. It's like you cannot speak about sacraments or moral life or prayer or anything about Christianity if it is not through the lens of vocation to being a missionary disciple. So we need women and men of all ages. That's the ultimate invitation in this directory. Women and men of all ages that embody our faith at all times through our words and actions.
So finally, are there any other topics or themes in this document that speak to your areas of research, study, and ministry, apart from the ones that we've already discussed?
Every single page. I was just looking at this this directory and going through the pages, and I'm thinking like yes to everything, because I mean, you and I are religious educators at heart. We love this beautiful vocation, this mission that we have, and definitely there are aspects though that I mean, every aspect of catechesis as defined by the directory somehow is an invitation to ponder about how we can connect it to our research and our teaching and what we do. I'm gonna narrow down on chapter 10, painfully not leaving out the other 11, because I could also speak about the other 11 chapters. But chapter 10, for many reasons, is a chapter that I found very rich, and that connects significantly with some of the research that I am advancing these days. I want to highlight 3 in particular. 3. aspects of that chapter 10. One, attention to young people. I think that, the directory is right on. What I like about this directory in this chapter 10 is that it does not treat young people just as subjects of, as objects of catechesis, It's not treating them as, okay, we gotta somehow teach the faith to these little ones, to these young people, and so so they finally, meet Christ and they stop doing whatever they are doing. So that's not the approach. The approach here is, how do we actually understand where young women and men in our society are? How do they make meaning? What are the questions that they are asking? How is it that they are pushing back, sometimes to our more traditional, structural, institutional ways of evangelizing and catechizing, and then learn from them, which is, I just find that fascinating, when when in that chapter there is a discussion, about social, social media and technology, and how young people inhabit those worlds. Well, I gotta say, we have a lot to learn. We got a lot to learn from young people, and got to find ways to integrate that, our catechetical efforts into what they are doing. And I like that part because I'm paying a lot of attention. For instance, in my research on Latinos, I'm looking, more closely about how Latinos are somehow negotiating this dual identity. And this is from a cultural perspective. This idea of being Latinos, and Latino Catholics, influenced by immigrants, parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and so on, and how they are negotiating their ways of being American. They are learning to be, part of a much larger culture, also as Catholics, And there's the element of social media, there's the element of culture, there is the element of questioning realities, participating, not participating. So I found that piece fascinating. The second piece in that chapter 10 that I want to highlight is urban ministry, but attention to what happens in the city. Pope Francis brought it up very clearly in Evangelii Gaudium, very clearly. We need to pay attention to what is happening in the cities, particularly the large cities, because the majority of people in the United States, the majority of people in Latin America, the majority of people almost in every continent live in large urban centers. When we have cities like Mexico City, when you have 20 people concentrated in a very small space, if you think about it, despite how large the city is, or when we look at cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, or we look at Houston, I mean, evangelizing and sharing the faith in those contexts really requires creativity. It really requires understanding the urban dynamics, all that goes on in the city, good and bad, sinful and graceful, and then how do we respond? Our churches, I mean, long gone, I should say, gone are the times when we used to have, I'm thinking here of the small towns in New England, but also you find them in the Midwest, where you had the church in the middle of the town, and then in front of the park, and a few homes around, and everything kind of, was around, the church, the park, and the city hall, That doesn't exist that much in these places, I mean, sometimes when I go to these big cities, I can walk for miles and not find a church. And then all of a sudden, I ask, where can I find a Catholic church? And say, like, you walked by it, and it doesn't look like a church, it's a different architecture. It's a different way of being church. And there are centers now that we find, universities. I find it fascinating that some of the most vibrant spaces of Catholicism in many cities are not even the churches, are actually universities or schools, or centers for evangelization. So I think that this directory is right onto something, an invitation into pastoral urbana, urban ministry, and a catechesis that pays attention to the growth of the cities and how life unfolds in the cities and how we encounter God there. And the last thing that I want to highlight and that I found very positive in this directory, and this is a novelty compared to the previous directories, is the attention to a catechesis that makes emphasis on the care of the created order. I think that this is very important. We're celebrating the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. I mean, we are seeing the consequences of not caring about the created order, and we need to learn more. How to cultivate, and take care of our home. Our shared home. And I think that a catechesis, that is authentically Christian, a catechesis that is authentically, caring about how we encounter God in reality, needs to pay attention to the created order. So those are some of the three, points that I would highlight, but there are many others, Jim, and I wish we had the time to speak about all of them.
That's right. But you've really highlighted so many excellent themes for us to just begin to reflect on, but then to carry further in conversations that we continue to have around this new directory for catechesis. Just like you, as I began to read it, I thought almost on every page there's something that could be the subject of a panel discussion or a conversation like this. So I'm very, very grateful. Thank you for sharing your observations and insights on this new directory for catechesis. This is a very busy time as we prepare for the start of a new semester, the fall semester. So I'm really very grateful for your time taken to share your thoughts and observations on these important themes. So thank you once again, and all the best for the start of the academic year.
Thank you very much. It's been a true pleasure being with you in conversation. Thank you.